Hoy nos va a hablar de realismo y utopía a propósito de la serie The Wire, pero yo creo que bueno, le podemos preguntar cosas después, no solo a propósito de su intervención de hoy, sino de su charla también del martes y de lo que estamos viendo en clase, porque yo creo que es un lujo el tenerle hoy aquí que podemos y debemos aprovechar.
I'm not going to read this paper, but you have this, I think, this essay, Realism and Utopia in the Wire, or you have it available. How many people have actually read it? You don't have it? I thought it was distributed to you.
Existe, al menos. Sí, os decía. Va a hablar sobre realismo y utopía en The Wire. Es un texto que podéis acceder en inglés. En cualquier caso, digo, va a subrayar algunos aspectos y lo va a conectar con cosas que hemos visto en clase, con su charla del martes a propósito de las mejores estrategias para representar el mundo en el que estamos, ¿no?
So they have not seen this. Yeah, I understand, but I just wondered if anyone had read it. So no one has read this. Okay. The second question would be, how many people have seen The Wire, some of The Wire? Not too many. And how many people, have you seen all of it or just part of it? How many people have seen all of it? Five years. Okay. All right. I'm not sure whether I tell you here the dates of the series and so forth, and I'm not really going to go into the history of the series and how it was produced and its reception and so on. But this has become, it was not enormously successful when it was appearing, and several times, as happens in television, there was a question of canceling the series, not enough viewers, and so on and so forth. But it survived. It's what is now a complete version. And I think, and it was always respected. People understood that this was something of great quality. But I think it's not until the DVDs began to come out that people could see it at home, see the whole series, that it became much more widely understood that this was a real classic and that it was very, very special in the history of both filmic drama and television itself. Norman Mailer, one of the great American writers who died recently, said at some point that maybe this new kind of television series was a rebirth in a different form of the novel itself. People have been talking about the death of the novel and so on and so forth. Television and film was obviously one, I won't say competitor, but cousin of the novel. Although I think it's very interesting that most films derive from short stories and not from novels. Now, if one wanted to pursue that theme, you could also say that some of the great modernist novels themselves derive from short stories. Ulysses of Joyce, which is, of course, 800 pages, began as a little short story of the length of Dubliners, which is Joyce's book of stories. The Magic Mountain also was supposed to be a story novella about the size of Death in Venice. So this is a very interesting, that would also testify to the crisis of the novel. The rebirth of the modernist novel also somehow comes out of short stories. But I think it's clear that it's rare that a film can really capture all the density of a novel. But now we have this new form, it has some parallels in literary history in the serial, for example. I don't know that all the great 19th century novels were serialized, but certainly there was a relationship between the development of the novel and serialization as that began in France and England and everywhere else, in the 1840s, with the birth of the popular newspaper. The newspaper that everyone could buy. Before that, as you know, the newspapers were very expensive. You had to take out a subscription in a reading room to read these things, and so on and so forth. But in 1838, maybe, I think it's Girardin and La Presse, I'm not sure, there appeared popular, cheap newspapers, and those became the vehicles for serials. So we have even Balzac. Balzac didn't begin that way, but he had to. The most famous in French was Eugène Sue, Les Mystères de Paris. Even Marx wrote about that. And then in England, Dickens. And I think this develops unevenly throughout the 19th century. And people have studied the serial, and it certainly solicited a special kind of attention. They say that in the United States, for example, with the great, these things would be published, Dickens novels, in the form of plaquette, of little special editions. So people would go down to the wharves, to the port in New York, and wait for the arrival from England of the latest episode in a Dickens novel. So they were very, very passionately sought after. And with this new kind of TV form, I think it's similar. People wait if you see something not as important as this, as Homeland, for example. Well, people wait on a Sunday night for the latest episode of Homeland and so on. But many of these things are organized around melodramatic. The thing of the serial, and then later on in the movies, is the what's called the cliffhanger. That is to say, at the end of each episode, something dramatic happens. In the latest Homeland, for example, it looks as though, I haven't seen the latest ones, the latest episodes, but the last episode I saw, there was an explosion, and it looked as though all the main characters had been killed. All right, so then you wait for the next. You assume that they're not, because it's going to go on, but you wait for the next thing. How is it going to be resolved? That's the cliffhanger, is the, you leave the heroine or the hero hanging from a cliff, and it's resolved. The Wire is a little different, I think, and certainly there's a different reception when it comes out in DVD form, because people tend to sit there and watch several episodes at a time, or even the whole series at one time if you have enough stamina. And one can do that. And these are 5 years of self-contained series. They pursue. They're not episodic. They are a continuous story with lots and lots of characters who intertwine. As I was looking at this again, I realized there come back to you all the great episodes, and you think, oh, I have to see this again. It's really, the acting is so tremendous. The characters are so wonderful. It's that you can see that multiple qualities have gone into this. And David Simon employed a lot of different writers of great quality in writing these episodes too. Often each episode is written by a different writer, often directed by a different writer. But Simon obviously was the one who put all this together. Now, I will say something about the story in a minute, but I want to say something first about, a new version of the novel, a new form which can do what the novel used to do, but which is different from an episodic television series, different from film, because this can be much more expansive and in time than even a long film or these silly trilogies that are coming out now in film, like the Hobbit or the Lord of the Rings or something. And we want to see if we can understand how that works, or at least how that worked in this case. I don't know anything quite like this. I mean, I have been disappointed with David Simon's recent work. I forget what he's working on now. But that's because you want him to do this all over again. I mean, it's so, there's nothing like it. And can he himself reproduce it? Well, you don't want that either. But I think there are no other series that are quite comparable to this in both the scope, but also the closure of each year. Because otherwise, I think things that are very popular, like The Sopranos or Breaking Bad, have to have self-contained episodes so they can continue on, so that you can jump in at any point. But here, this is something different, like a novel. You don't pick up a novel and decide to read just chapter 5 or something. It is self-contained, and this is self-contained like that. Now, I want to say a few words, and I do so in this essay, about the crisis in mass culture, in order to show you what's special. One of the things that's special about this, because obviously I can't discuss it all. And there's increasingly a lot written about The Wire in many languages. There's a French collection of stuff on The Wire, which includes my essay, but is mostly by French critics. And I think probably in many languages, people have been fascinated by this and have written about it. Okay, so the crisis in mass culture. I think one of them, I would say, is I describe as the crisis of melodrama. Melodrama was always a staple of mass culture as opposed to high culture, if you like, literary culture. Now, literary culture has always included melodramatic elements, and I think that's even more true of theater and of the film that in the silent period came out of theater. But on the whole, literature, what we think of as classical literature, has attempted to escape its melodramatic elements. Melodrama, I think, can be defined as and there are various meanings of it, obviously, but can be defined as a plot organized around the struggle between good and evil. Melodrama requires villains, and then by opposition, it requires victims and heroes, I would say. So there has to be a notion of innocence. This is generally gendered, I would say. That is to say, the victim is a woman, coming out of the 18th century novel. The innocent victim is a woman. The villain is a man, a seducer, an evil priest in the English tradition, because Catholic priests are evil in the Protestant traditions, and so on and so forth in the Gothic novel. But in the literary novel, as it develops in the 19th century, there is an effort to purge the novel of these melodramatic elements and to do something else. And I write about that a little bit in my book on the novel, Antinomies of Realism, which came out, I think it's not in Spanish, huh?
Not yet.
Yeah. In particular for one of the major novelists in the tradition, George Eliot, about how George Eliot attempts to escape this binary opposition of good and evil and to do something else, and to understand, to suppress the difference in such a way that the good characters are much more complicated and ambiguous, and the evil characters are much less melodramatic and themselves become ambiguous. I think this represents a waning of the very idea of evil itself. Evil is, if we follow Nietzsche and subsequent analysts of all this stuff, evil is essentially otherness. In Nietzsche, later on in Sartre and so forth, you have an analysis whereby what we consider good is simply ourselves and our class. Evil is otherness. This obviously discredits the theological notion of good and evil. And I would say that in general, as enlightenment has expanded, otherness itself has diminished. Let me put it this way. You have Habermas's, this is something in the essay, you have Habermas's notion of universal communication, rationality as communication. This means that rationality is based on mutual understanding, and little by little irrationality as understanding all kinds of people and all kinds of behavior. As that increases, what's reserved for irrationality will necessarily diminish. My thesis would be that today, really, nothing is irrational anymore. We understand everything. I mean, we understand the most acts that would formerly have been considered the most irrational acts. If you look, for example, at Foucault's work on these serial killers, I forget what the famous, Moi, Pierre Rivière, I don't know if any of you have read this text from the 19th century. Pierre Rivière was a farm boy who killed his parents, I believe. These, for the 19th century, were hideous examples of the irrational, of the incomprehensible, and therefore of some kind of absolute evil. Even in Kant already, radical evil, absolute evil is what is absolutely unmotivated. Kant had to still retain a category of the unmotivated crime, the incomprehensible crime, of people who do evil for the sake of evil, if that's possible. Well, I think that today, more and more, nothing is incomprehensible to us with the spread of psychiatry and so on and so forth. Well, if that's so, then you can see how that would strike a terrible blow to melodrama itself. Because melodrama, if it depends on the category of evil, and if the category of evil is being reduced and diminished, where do you get your villains from? In the 19th century and in popular culture up until recently, there was a wide variety of evil motivations available. In the mystery story, in melodrama of all kinds. And popular culture, mass culture, drew on this variety of villainies for its plots. And I'm going to be talking now about the construction of plot. But if little by little, well, for example, money. If everything is reduced to money, all crimes are reduced to money, then it's not interesting anymore, right? Everyone understands money as a motivation. Is it evil? Corruption? If it's universal, it's not evil anymore in that older sense. So plots based on killing people for money are boring, right? They can no longer furnish the material for melodrama. So what's left then? I see two kinds of evil which are prevalent in contemporary mass culture, in the construction of plot in contemporary mass culture. One, and this is everywhere, all the books that you read, the junk books that you can read today, everywhere you find a single kind of figure, the serial killer, right? Okay. That means that, that there's a great monotony about this, obviously. It has some kind of sexual overtone, serial killing, sometimes more, sometimes less. But this seems to be the only form of melodrama that people can imagine nowadays. So mass culture is really reduced to something very monotonous. That's one form of evil. The other form of evil, of course, is the terrorist. Both of these are unmotivated, right? The serial killer kills everybody just because he has to, generally he. And the terrorist, well, who knows, but the terrorist kills himself, kills other people, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem is that ultimately, if you want to make a serial killer interesting, you've got to probe down into some psychoanalytic roots and find some kind of explanation. And it turns out to be abuse as a child or something like that, right? Well, then that sort of gets rid of that. The terrorist, if you look more closely, if the terrorist turns into a political figure, then we're out of melodrama, because politics is politics, right? It's not evil anymore. Everybody, political movements, whatever they are, however violent, you don't think of them in moral terms anymore. You think of them in political terms. So the terrorist risks disappearing as a staple of melodrama, and the serial killer becomes more and more monotonous and more problematic. And of course, in the United States, there's also this relatively new category of pedophilia. And child abuse itself, and but I don't know that a lot of, because it's very dark, and I don't know that a lot of mass culture has been based on that. Now it's kind of hard to dramatize a villain in those terms. So as I say, there is a crisis in mass culture, in the construction of plot. What do you make a melodramatic plot out of anymore when you don't have villains? Okay, one mode of escape is that this struggle between the hero and the villain will no longer be individual, but will be collective. You can see this in the detective story. Once upon a time, there were individual detectives, private detectives, for example. Sherlock Holmes is a private detective who works sometimes for the government. His brother is in the Foreign Office, sometimes for the police. Dupin, and he gets money from this. Then we get, a little by little, a transformation, and all the way up into the 20th century, we have the great private detectives, Poirot, Miss Marple, Raymond Chandler's Marlowe, and so on and so forth. And then I guess there are fewer and fewer private detectives in real life. I don't know. But there are certainly fewer and fewer in fiction. And so there is a transition from the individual private detective, like Marlowe, to the policeman. And with the policeman, there develops this form which is called the police procedural. And at its best, that comes to involve a whole team of, a whole collective, a whole team of police. And you can do a lot with that. So you have a comic, stupid policeman, you have a bureaucratic policeman, you have various, and then there's the lead one and his friends. I think the greatest series, I don't know if it's read here, is the Swedish one, Sjöwall and Velo, 10 books on whose nominal hero is, it's always called the Martin Beck series, but that's not quite right, because he really is surrounded by, he is the hero, but he's surrounded by other idiosyncratic colleagues. For example, there's one colleague, I can't remember his name, who specializes in remembering names of criminals. He's sort of a computer in his own right. But whenever they want him, he's in the bathroom. So this is the kind of comic, one-dimensional sort of comedy of this collective thing. Well, now, what tends to happen in this evolution is that little by little, and I think it's not only a reflection of our suspicions of the police itself, which of course today I think are very great for a lot of different reasons. The police is the state, it's state repression and so on. But I think it reflects something deeper, which is that the police procedural turns into a critique of bureaucracy. The hero policeman is fighting not just the criminals, and even not especially the criminals, but his own bureaucracy, the police itself. He has to struggle against his own, not immediate colleagues, but the hierarchy itself. And I think that's a very interesting development. And you have it already in Sjöwall and Velo. The police commissioner is always an idiot. And the various chiefs are stupid, and they obstruct the investigation and so on and so forth. So what begins to come through this new collectivization of melodrama is a critique of bureaucracy itself. People don't understand, people talk about, just to open a parenthesis, about socialist realism. I was asked a question in Barcelona yesterday about what kind of art or literature would be produced under utopia. Well, I think it's not generally understood in the West that the proper form of socialist realism is the critique of bureaucracy, right? The fundamental danger of all socialist organization is bureaucracy. So the writers take this as their mission to try to ward off the reification of the inevitable bureaucratic system. People don't understand that bureaucracy can also be a heroic thing. I mean, and a very admirable thing. If you think, for example, in the late 19th century, my references are always French, to the French instituteurs, to the school teachers who went out in the countryside to teach peasant children and to fight the influence of the church, because the church was always there in the countryside with its schools and its obfuscation and so on. That's a very heroic moment of French democracy, French liberalism. So, or you think of social workers, people who go among the poor in order to cater to health needs and so on and so forth. This is a heroic bureaucracy, but generally when we say bureaucracy, we think of it as something bad and stultifying and so on and so forth. So the critique of bureaucracy begins to appear. Now, with The Wire, what becomes interesting is not only that, because that's very central, but is something happening on the other side. So just as the forces of order have become bureaucratized, so also crime has become bureaucratized. Crime is also collective. Because remember, these individual criminals, serial killer, terrorists, because we think of terrorists as individuals, that doesn't work anymore. So we need a collective of crime. And obviously, the first form is the mafia, and then in general, drugs and so on. And this can also become very conventional. So it's always the worst of the mafia now are not Italians, Neapolitans, or Sicilians, but the Russians. And whenever you want something really brutal in mafiosi, you turn to the Russian mafia and so forth. I don't know. This is an Orientalism, really, right? It's part of our the general Western attitude towards the East, the Slavs, the Balkans, and so on and so forth. But we'll leave that to one side. Now, but in general, I would say that the crime bureaucracy has tended to be organized around drugs. Okay, well, that's sort of the beginning of The Wire, because we have a standard police force, which patrols the streets in a routine way, and answers various calls. Married couples fighting violently who have to be separated, drug traffic, occasional murders, and so on and so forth. And then on the side of the criminals, what you have is what in David Simon in Baltimore is called the corner. That is street drugs. And I think it's not unknown, but maybe The Wire has made it more known that this is generally, the street drugs are generally trafficked by kids who are, in the United States at least, under the age of prosecution. Not under the age of prosecution, but under the age of adult sentencing. Because if they're young enough, you can't do anything to them. So you have these kids running around in the Wire. This is very richly developed, and I think these street kids of David Simon are among some of the most marvelous creations in The Wire itself, in terms of characters and acting and events and so on and so forth. One of these kids is what's his name? I can't remember. Is certainly one of the main characters in the Wire. So you get scenes where all of a sudden the chief, the police hero, Jimmy, and this kid are sitting down talking to each other, eating something, and just talking to each other. It's not a criminal confrontation, but they're sort of exchanging. This is one of the wonderful side effects of The Wire, that it's sort of broadened out in such a way that you can have these kinds of encounters, which they're not plot driven, but suddenly these two completely antagonistic representatives of these opposing collectivities are having a quiet chat about whatever. I mean, I think that's the mark of a great novel, or something, that you can have moments of islands of tranquility like this, episodes in which are completely in the spirit of the plot and the characters, but which are not part of some onward driving melodramatic plot. Okay, so in the beginning, it's like that. The standard police who are making their rounds either on foot or in the cars, and the standard drug deals which are going on in the street, which the police break up, or they arrest these kids and then have to let them go, and so on and so forth. And there's some sense that obviously there's an organization behind that. These kids don't get the drugs themselves. They don't, I think the way somebody stops in a car, kid goes over, finds out what he wants, runs back inside, gets the drugs from somebody else, and so on. The money is swiftly transferred so that the police have a hard time finding them, and so on. Now, what begins to happen in The Wire, however, is that there's a mysterious murder. I should talk a little about the background of this, though. That's another important topic in contemporary mass culture. It's the regionalism of contemporary mass culture. I think that almost every major city in the world now, lots and lots of mystery stories are written and published today. I mean, I would say every major city in the world today has somebody setting his or her detective novels in that city. And increasingly, one of the functions of the mystery novel is not just to divert you with a plot, but to evoke space and geography and the uniqueness of a certain city. And in the United States, at least, it's almost absolute. We have a North Carolina detective. We have there are St. Paul, Minneapolis detectives. There are every state practically has. Some of them of no quality whatsoever, but nonetheless, people are sitting there scribbling out mystery stories which take all these places as locales. I think that has to do with postmodernity. Maybe we'll talk with that later on. It is certainly part of the spatialization of postmodernity, and the way in which time is. There are historical detective novels, but for me, they're not interesting. I think there is a kind of tourism available in this genre. So you're not going to travel to holy cities, but the various detective stories gives you a chance to sort of sample what it might be like to live in Minneapolis, St. Paul, let's say, or in Kansas City, and obviously then there are the great cities of crime. I would say the very center of the American crime novel is Los Angeles. You've probably seen L.A. Confidential, the film, the various series. Our greatest writer, I think now, Michael Connelly, is the epic poet of Los Angeles in many ways, but this goes back to Chandler and the very history of the city itself, which is less so. I don't think of so many New York novels, or maybe there's so many that you can't identify any single one, but really, but what I'm talking about is something different from that. I'm talking about a kind of multiplicity of an intimate relationship between plot, not plot construction, but the detective story plot and the city, and the exotic locality. And then, so if you read detective stories, you're interested not just in these American ones, but you're interested in Chinese detective stories, for example. Now we have a Shanghai detective. I can't remember who it is, but those are being translated. Those are very interesting. How does he function? And so forth. Obviously, they're your standard French detectives. There's Camilleri with Sicily, and these then spawn television series and so on. Here you have Vázquez Montalbán in Barcelona. Madrid detectives, there must be millions of them, but I don't know who they are. And there must be Andalusian detectives and so on and so forth. Basque detectives. Anyway, so if you're just speaking as an American, you're interested in reading those. And into that opening, which is the combination of the reemergence of this genre as a social commentary, and I'll say something about that in a moment, and tourism itself, that is the spatial fascination with other parts of the world, into that opening suddenly flows an immense economic phenomenon, which is Scandinavian detective stories. Suddenly, they discovered both in television series and in the mystery novel that there was an immense field there. And I think the various Scandinavian governments, because they're detectives from all of them, including Finland and Iceland, it's as though all these governments subsidized people to write up their own local detectives, and because it also adds to tourism. There are tourist visits to Los Angeles based on some of these detectives, just as you might in the old days have taken a tour of the Sherlock Holmes locations. Well, now it becomes very interesting for us to go to Norway because we've read a lot of Norwegian detective stories and so on. To Denmark because we have not only the stories, but we have The Killing, the various TV series and so on, The Killing, The Bridge, and so on and so forth. So that's an immensely interesting mass cultural phenomenon, this sudden eruption of Scandinavia into this field. And nothing like that, I think, has happened. And it's very characteristic, I think, of postmodernity. There's good Australian science fiction, but it's not like that. I mean, this is a very interesting special case. Okay, so all of that as a prelude to the locality of The Wire, which is, of course, Baltimore. Baltimore is a place where it's a ruined city, not exactly a Rust Belt city as we call a place like Pittsburgh, not exactly a completely devastated city like Detroit, but nonetheless not a very stellar thing, which is characterized, first of all, you go to Baltimore to eat soft-shell crabs. This is the famous thing in Baltimore. You know what a soft-shell crab is. That's their specialty. They were one of the first to pioneer the gentrification of the waterfront. So the whole development since then of everything from Sydney to I don't know where else, the transformation of an abandoned waterfront into luxury boutiques and restaurants and so on and so forth, that really started in Baltimore. But otherwise, I always think of Lacan's remark. There was a famous in the introduction of structuralism in the United States was pioneered by a famous conference at Johns Hopkins, which is the great university at Baltimore, which assembled in the 1960s sometime, I'm not sure when. Lacan was there, Derrida, all these people who were not yet very well known outside of France came to this conference. Lacan came down on the train from New York and is supposed to have said what we know he said. On a sleeper, I think trains were slower in those days. What is the unconscious? L'inconscient. L'inconscient, c'est Baltimore à l'aube. The unconscious is Baltimore at dawn. You know, you raise the curtain of your train compartment and look out at this thing that you're entering, you know. So that's Baltimore. Now, here, we don't have Johns Hopkins, I don't think. But we really don't have anything except Baltimore itself. In most cities, there's a comparatist element. That is to say, I prefer today Philadelphia to New York because, and so on and so forth. In The Wire, nothing else exists but Baltimore. You don't, and I sort of go through that here. You have, and these people live in such an urban setting that they don't even know about the. Maryland is famous for its coasts and so on, and sailing and that kind of recreation. These kids do not even know what the sea is, what nature is. I mean, there's an episode, very sad, one of the great famous episodes of The Wire, in which one of these little kids is sent off to his grandmother's house, which is down by the ocean. And he's never seen nature, and it's horrible. And he has to come back. He has to come back to the corner because he can't stand it, where he is in fact killed. So that nature doesn't exist. What are the outside references? All right, Annapolis is the capital of Maryland. That's important because the police is funded out of Annapolis. So we get some references to that. We get some references to Philadelphia because they tend to go up there to deliver the drugs and also to buy the throwaway cell phones that are one of the functions of this story. Because The Wire, the title is not the kind of wire you wear when you confront the crooked businessman and try to get him to reveal things. The Wire is rather how you tap into phone conversations. And it's made more difficult because, first of all, they just use pagers, and then they begin to use these throwaway phones that can't be traced and so forth. So it turns on that. That's, I think, an interesting part of this topic, but we won't go into it any further. But so Philadelphia, you buy all these things. And as for New York, well, that's where you hire killers who are to remain anonymous. You want to hire a special killer to take care of somebody important. It can't be somebody local. So you send to New York for this guy. Otherwise, nothing exists outside of Baltimore in this thing, and it's very interesting. Now, this should be what you would call a black film. Most of the actors are black. Many of them, you know, it's not easy for black actors to find jobs because of unemployed black actors and also non-professional actors. And an amazing range of talent. And the police themselves are at least half black. It's not a situation like Henderson, Missouri today, where you have a white police force and a black population. The police chief is black, and so on and so forth. The bureaucracy, in other words, is also black. And the political structure of Baltimore itself, well, it's essentially, as we see it in The Wire, it's a black city. So we don't see the other wealthy white parts or any of that stuff. But it's not an ethnic thing. Now, with black films and so forth, this is things, you know how, I don't think we pay enough attention, we males, to the necessity of having yourself inserted in the film. So, for example, I once heard, I don't know what I was going to see, but there was a group of black people buying tickets, and this one woman was saying, "Are there black people in this movie? Because I don't want to see it if there are no black people in there." So you realize, you know. Now, something, as I say, we males don't realize is that for women, that's also true, right? That when you get a film which is all male, like a war movie, well, there's nothing really in it for women, and so on and so forth. So, the so-called the black genre would cater to those publics. And now, for example, adventure films, you've seen this in the Mel Gibson films and so on, you have two detectives, one white, one black. That way, there is something for everybody, right? And you can sort of draw all this in. In The Wire, this is not so. This is not a black film, a black series. In fact, there's so many different kinds of black people, if I may speak that way physically, that the very notion of blackness disappears. It's not an ethnic notion anymore. These are not black people. I mean, they're just people, I mean, of a tremendous variety. It's what you would call a post-racial film, I think. But there are ethnic groups in The Wire. And especially in the second episode, I'll talk about that later, you have the Poles. And the Poles are very strongly ethnic, and there's struggles within the Polish community and so on. And you can see that in the police force. Well, the Poles are, they're represented by the unions. The police force, insofar as it's white, is of course represented by the Irish. The Irish are traditionally the police, and so on and so forth. But not the black actors in this film, or the black characters. So that's an interesting novelty. It makes me think of a friend of mine years ago who went to a historian sociologist who went to work in British Guyana. Now it's just Guyana, I guess. And in Guyana, there's a very special situation. You have a very small white population, rich probably. You have a very large working class population of Indian origin. You know the writer Naipaul. You know that in the Caribbean there is an Indian population. And the ruling class is black. Of Guyana. And therefore, so he said to me once, he said, you know, the bourgeoisie is black, in other words. You live here long enough and you have enough contacts with people, you'd just begin to assume that you're black too, because you're a bourgeois. They're the bourgeoisie, they're the ruling class. You are essentially connected to them. The others are others. And so the usual stereotypes dissolve. And I think something like that is true of The Wire as well. Now, so this takes place in Baltimore, and as I say, is precipitated by this first strange murder, which is the murder of a white man in an essentially black and drug-oriented neighborhood. Now, what you find out is that this police force, which is picking up people and on the corners and so on, doesn't have the slightest idea what's going on in the drug neighborhoods. The police, there has to emerge from the police force a special unit, which is that of The Wire, which will deal specifically with this kind of, with a kind of crime that, with an organization of crime that the police has never bothered to really understand. So that the very head of the crime. I don't want to call it syndicate. These are collectivities that are created in time and history and so on. The current head of this, and one of the things about The Wire is the sense of historical transformation in all of this. The head of this current crime drug syndicate is essentially a black syndicate. Is completely unknown to the police. They don't even know his name. They find out little by little who he is. They don't have a picture of him. They don't know anything about him. He stages a baseball game, maybe it's a basketball game, between his gang and a rival gang. This is the first time they see him. His name is Barksdale. And his family will play a role in all of this. Then it turns out he is the boss, but he's not the organizer. As in monarchies and even most political systems, probably, you have the titular leader of the political institution. And then you have an éminence grise, a secondary prime minister, let's say, who really runs the show. And it turns out that Barksdale has such a prime minister. And we gradually get to know him. And this will be, I think, one of the most interesting developments in all of this. But meanwhile, the police have to create a counter-institution which can investigate all this and discover all this. And this is how the two central figures of this whole first year episode come into being. And I think this is will already be utopian in the sense I'm going to use the word. Because the genius of this operation is a very unassuming guy named Lester Freeman, who has been sort of, he's a career policeman, but nobody knows what to do with him, and they've relegated him to I think most police departments have archives, and you sit down there, and somebody wants to see the exhibits from an old case, maybe an unsolved case, and you have to go down and find the box and bring it up with whatever survives of that thing. So which is not a very demanding job, clearly. He sits down there and he has a hobby, which is making miniature furniture. But it's miniature furniture, how can I say, very authentic. That is to say, he will make 17th century French chairs or Chippendale tables or whatever, little tiny things, which then he sells and makes a profit on. Now, the point is, okay, so we already have, in capitalism, as work gets more and more standard, creativity takes refuge in the hobby. And so this hobby of Lester Freeman, this is where real creativity lies. He has knowledge. He has to know about these styles. He's got manual gifts and so on and so forth. And you can see it's a kind of parable of how the system doesn't use its talent. And so the talent has to take refuge into this, in this kind of hobby, from which then he can derive a kind of secondary minor income of some sort. But the system is not using people like that. Now it turns out this guy is a genius. And he can solve any kind of problem. He can find these networks. He can follow the money, as they say in All the President's Men. He can find the financial dealings of these and investments of these this drug money and so on. He can solve technical problems of wires and how you listen into these things and so on. And finally, he doesn't come across as a leader. That would be more the police heroes, Jimmy and so forth, and his partner. But he is really at the center. He can handle these people. He can create their missions for them, and they put together this group of detectives. But I think it's very important to see that already we're getting a kind of parable here of how, in an absolutely frozen, stale, bureaucratized system, you have to make a little exceptional corner and space for some new kind of creativity, intellectual, manual, organizational, even political, to appear. And this is, there is also clearly the critique of bureaucratic stupidity. But this is a deeper kind of critique, because this shows us that there are positive creative forces possible somewhere here, which are different from the bureaucratic ones. So it's not just the critique of bureaucracy as a bunch of grotesques, but it's this new kind of creative force. Okay, so that already, I think, is a proto-utopian element. That is, it suggests that new kinds of creativity and change are possible, or might be possible if there were a space for them. That's happening on the police side of things. What about crime? It's clear that Barksdale is not an unintelligent man, but he's not creative. It's the other guy. This actor has now become famous, Idris Elba, in a lot of things which are not as good as his role in The Wire. His name is Stringer. All these people have different names. Stringer is one of the great characters in The Wire. And incidentally, one of the strangest things about this for us is that the two principal characters, Jimmy the policeman, who's an Irish-American policeman, and Stringer, who is this real force behind the crime syndicate, they're both English actors. I think English actors learn, one of the things they learn in their acting schools is how to speak American accents and to play Americans and so on. So you would never have thought that if you hadn't known it, that these typically American figures were in fact Brits. So Stringer, it turns out to be the creativity on that side of things. How do we know that? Well, Jimmy, the policeman, gets onto his trail at some point. He sees him visiting. He has to go down and visit the corners and tell these kids what to do every so often in moments of crisis. He has to handle this murder, which is a great nuisance and was a kind of accident. So Jimmy sees him and wonders who he was. As I say, the police don't know who these people are even. Should somebody answer that? And so he catches sight of him, he decides to follow him. Well, then Stringer gets in a car. I think I was wrong to say, but isn't it Hopkins that he goes? He drives to a community college. Jimmy follows him, going into the classroom, thinks, is he about to do a drug deal in there? He goes into a classroom, door is shut, class starts. He looks through the window, Jimmy, and Stringer is there in a business administration class. And he's doing his homework, like a good business student, and learning how a business is organized. And then, little by little, he will use the language of business, the product, the consumer, and so on and so forth, to describe this increasingly sophisticated organization of the drug trade. And of course, the boss doesn't really know anything about this. Their relations are very interesting because you can see that he has the power, but he also understands that Stringer is somehow smarter than he is and is doing something else that he doesn't really understand. And so there are moments of tension, but he needs him, right? Because this is the real organizational force. So on the side, this is, I think, generally true of crime. The mafia, the history of the mafia in the United States, well, takes twofold. There's one moment in which, I guess they're sort of simultaneous, in which the mafia is reorganized as a business, and this was sort of accompanied in the history of the Italian mafia, American Italian mafia, by a crime leader, a mafia leader, who was very interested, being an Italian, in Roman history. So he adopted a lot of categories of the Roman Empire for these new business positions in the mafia and so on. Here we have something a little different, but it is also the progression of the mafia from ordinary, brutal kind of trafficking to a well-organized system, which is in fact business itself. Now, after the end of this regime in the drug trade, Barksdale is succeeded by a truly brutal character named Marlowe, but in whom the same transformation rapidly takes place. That is, Marlowe is a real, I won't say a thug, but a sadist, and obviously enjoys the killing that has to be done. But he has to hook up with his lawyers and his business associates, and little by little they teach him. Stringer developed this himself, but with Marlowe, these lawyers teach him how to behave like a businessman. You've got to meet these politicians. You have to make your deals with them. You have to learn business manners, right? To dress properly and so on and so on. So there too, in a speed-up version, we get the transformation of outright thuggery and brutal sort of crime into some sophisticated business dealings, and one can then politically extrapolate that as much as one likes. Okay, and now I'll go a little faster on this. So you see how this makes a place in melodrama for something quite different from ordinary melodrama. We're not talking about evil anymore. We're talking about the emergence of social institutions and the emergence of counter-institutions. So we have, on the one hand, the emergence of this little team around the wire, which is an intelligent form of investigation with capacities to understand to follow these networks in all kinds of directions. On the other hand, we have the emergence on the crime side of a whole business administration, which involves meetings with your competitors. So there are periodic moments in which a kind of cartel is formed, and all of the leaders of the different gangs sit down to keep order, keep the peace, settle whatever accounts. It's the famous stuff that you find emerging in the mafia, with the moments of crisis and so forth. We find all that going on a collective basis. Okay, that sets the scene then for the next episodes, and I won't go through them in great detail, but I want to show how each one then is organized around the plot of each of these years. Each one is a separate year that can be seen by itself. Each one is organized around a separate industry. Okay, we had the theme of business itself and business organization in the first one. Now we will get, I don't know if you know Sarah Paretsky's mysteries. Those are all based on, in Chicago, all based on different industries. And here we have the second year, which is based on the port and the unions, the longshoremen, and their industrial crisis, the crisis of the Port of Baltimore, the deterioration of the Port of Baltimore, which is brought on by technology. That is to say, the key event for shipping was containerization, the invention of the container, and there are now histories of that process. And that rendered many of the ports in the United States and probably elsewhere absolutely redundant. It also reduced the workforce because with these great containers, you don't need the kind of workforce that you used to have in traditional times. You know that in the United States, the longshoremen were the most radical of all the unions. Harry Bridges on the West Coast controlled much of the left politics in that part of the country. On the East Coast, it was the mafia, and you know that in a way, during the war, the American government made arrangements with the mafiosi in the ports who had their contacts in Italy to undermine Mussolini and so on and so forth. So all kinds of things went on in this port area. Okay, so that's the second industry. The third year has to do with the legality of drugs. The fourth year has to do with education. And the fifth year was to be, I think, technically based in the newspaper. David Simon was a newspaper man, and organized around that. It doesn't quite come off, but one sees that that was also to be a separate industry. And that's the conclusion of the season. Okay, now, how is any of this utopian? Well, because each of these things, and they have very different, very interesting spatial backgrounds and so on, especially the port, of course, is an amazing kind of thing. In the port, the labor leader, who is corrupt in the sense that he allows the drug trade to continue under his auspices. He allows, in this sort of forest, if you call it that, of containers, various ones are used secretly for transport of drugs and so on. He knows that's going on, and he made a deal with but he's using this money in a different way. This corrupt labor leader wants to use the money for what is essentially a utopian project, the revitalization of the Port of Baltimore. He understands that unions, the lifeblood of the unions is in this revitalization of the port. Without that, the Port of Baltimore is essentially dead. Newark captured the center of containerization at the very beginning of this process, and you can't really compete unless you really redo this. Now, I've already said that in a way, it's clear that he failed. The Port of Baltimore was not revitalized, and I told you what took its place. The gentrification of the waterfront, the creation of boutiques and so on and so forth, of which Baltimore was a pioneer. But in this historical moment, Frank, who's the union leader, has this utopian project of transforming, bringing back labor, bringing back business and shipping activity to the Port of Baltimore and so on. I call this a utopian activity, a utopian construction, because, not just because it didn't happen, but because it is a figure for social transformation in general, and the impossibility of doing that. Frank has to fail. That's the necessity of this development of capitalism. The Port of Baltimore cannot be revived. But were it possible, one could glimpse a whole revitalization of Baltimore itself, right, on this basis. So Frank is a political visionary in that sense. His vision of the transformation of the port is a utopian vision of the future. And so now we have, and this is very rare, I think, in these plots, we have a motivation which is not that of greed or money, which is not that of the other forms of evil, but which is in fact one of social transformation itself, something positive. It's very rare that you can make the future is introduced into this plot. This plot is really constructed around a movement towards the future. Now, that itself, I think, in mass culture is not today unusual. It seems to me that much of realistic mass culture incorporates a certain science fictional element. If you think of films, earthquake, okay, Los Angeles destroyed by an earthquake. Well, you've got realism, but there is a future catastrophe in store for us. That's science fiction, right? But that's incorporated in the realist bestseller. So the bestseller as a realistic form is encroached today by all kinds of science fictional impending future events. Well, that's negative. Here we have something positive. The future is attempting to be born in this melodramatic situation, but it fails. Okay. Is there anything similar in the third year? Yes, of course, because there's a far-seeing police, he's not a chief, I don't know what you call him, a captain, I guess, of a certain part of the city, who decides that the war on drugs is ridiculous. It can't be won. And the way to proceed is to create legal drug zones. In other words, to legalize drugs. Now, that's also a utopian proposal. We have indeed a utopian space opening up in which a different kind of legality exists. Obviously, it can't be allowed to continue. And so the failure of that utopian effort is the end of the third season. But this is also an attempt to transform something. Now, neither of these things is a political message. It seems to me you don't get the sense that David Simon is saying, oh, the only way for our city to come back is for us to pour money into things like the revitalization of the port, or the only way to deal with this tremendous drug problem and corruption and so on is to legalize drugs. It's not a political message like that. It's a utopian message. We're shown both the attempt to transform and then the resistance to it. In the fourth episode, it's education. One of the members of the team who has thrown out of the police force goes back to teaching. He happens to be a mathematical whiz, even though he's clearly a dummy in all other respects. But a very interesting teacher who introduces computers into his school and tries to resist the encroachment of what wrecks American education today, these standardized tests. You know, the students have to make a certain, reach a certain level in these tests that are administered from long distance in order for the teacher even to keep his or her job. So the standardized test means that regular education is reduced to studying for this test and is made one-dimensional, bureaucratized, specialized by the imposition of the testing requirement, of the uniformization of education. So this teacher has attempted introducing, has excited all these poor students from the underclass areas, by the possibilities of using computers and so on, doing new kinds of problems and so forth, and that has to be shut down for because of the more universal requirement of testing. So here also we have a utopian a utopian space opening up and then shut down. Finally, in the last section, it's a little more problematic. The police, there are cuts in the money available to police, so the money to support an operation like The Wire itself, like this small group. So Jimmy takes it upon himself, the policeman, to artificially manufacture a serial killer who's supposed to be killing homeless people. And he does this by finding the body of a homeless person and then leaving some false evidence, which that requires then the whole police department, and this is fed to the newspaper, which is, as I say, the central industry of this last thing. And it's publicized by the newspaper, pressures brought to bear on the police, and they have to find money then to chase this serial killer. So he manages to resupply the police department itself. That's a kind of an ironic utopian attempt to transform the whole system of finance and support for these public institutions, it seems to me. It's not altogether the most successful of the seasons, but of course it also has to stop. I mean, because you can't have that kind of thing, and it's a very strange thing. So I think I'll stop at that point. That was the purpose of my essay, to show how we have here not just a very unusual new form and a immensely successful new form, which will henceforth be classic for this kind of new version of the novel. But we also have a new utopian form of plot construction in which there is a whole message about change which is not delivered in a thesis way, but in which history itself is shown as attempting to emerge, being thwarted, taking another path, and so on and so forth. So Lukács thought that realism was not just the representation of society as it is, but ought to tap the underlying movement of history and transformation at work in a given society. Well, it seems to me that The Wire today, you have to have a certain, you have to take a certain, how can I say, advance on that and show how history might happen as opposed to how it does happen, and I think that's what this text does. Okay, I've talked too much. Sorry. Thank you.
Pues muchísimas gracias, profesor Jameson. Creo que ha quedado bastante clara la conexión con muchas de las cosas que vemos en una escuela como esta, por subrayar algunas de las más evidentes, ¿no? Los retos a los que se tiene que enfrentar todo aquel que quiera crear productos culturales, artísticos y significativos, sobre todo, cuando ya no funcionan a lo mejor las categorías de los villanos o los malos puros, ¿no? Cómo crear ficción eficazmente simbólica en ausencia de mal. Otro también muy evidente que hemos visto, ¿no? El papel que juega la ciudad y la experiencia urbana en la configuración de la vida y de la conciencia de los individuos, y qué papel tiene esto en la ficción, como ha subrayado el profesor Jameson, ¿no? Curiosamente, en la ficción posmoderna hay un cierto regreso al regionalismo, ¿no? Cada gran ciudad tiene su propia ficción, su propia obra de arte, y esa conexión interesante, como si fuese un catálogo al servicio del turismo, ¿no? de una industria del turismo. En fin, para mí las conexiones con lo que nos preocupa en un sitio como Sur son muy claras, y la verdad es que tengo muchas preguntas, pero haré solo dos, y con la esperanza de que haya más. La primera sería si usted cree que un tipo de ficción o representación artística cultural como esta, bien hecha, cuando funciona, como también la serie a la que se refirió el martes, Traffic, si puede tener efectos políticos, en un sentido amplio, apoyándome en lo que decía al final de Lukács, ¿no? Pensando en transformación social. Si además de el puro placer al consumirla por su verosimilitud, puede tener efectos políticos en el sentido de transformación social. Esa sería una pregunta que a lo mejor no se puede contestar, pero creo que es interesante. Y la segunda, si en conexión con estos problemas a los que se enfrenta la ficción a la hora de representar la realidad y lo sofisticado que es un producto como The Wire, ¿no? En el que los buenos y los malos comparten estructuras, hay una burocracia del bien, si el bien es la policía, y hay una burocracia del mal, si el mal son los vendedores de drogas. Si, curiosamente, no hay una presencia de elementos melodramáticos en la política real y en el análisis de esa realidad que realiza, por ejemplo, el periodismo. Es decir, si la ficción parece que tiene que abordar estrategias mucho más sofisticadas para representar la realidad de un modo eficaz, porque ya no nos sirve el melodrama como forma de consumo, mientras que a lo mejor sobreviven elementos muchas veces dramáticos y puramente melodramáticos en el análisis de la realidad que nos ofrece el discurso explícito político y que a menudo nos ofrece el periodismo. Son, vamos, dos preguntas de las muchas que me sugería su intervención.
Yeah, I think you can tie this back into my lecture, those of you who heard that the other day. I mean, we are talking about a representation of totality. Baltimore functions as the totality of capitalism in some sense. And I think we also see here something I came to at the end of that talk, which is that today any representation like that has to be ad hoc. It has to be unique. It can't be repeated. The Wire involved a very special plot construction that I think could not become, this is not a standard police procedural. You can't just make more of these. It's a very special combination of materials that really can't be imitated. Does it have political? I think that we shouldn't think of political art as something which sends you out to do political things. I mean, there is a place for an art like that. Revelations in the United States, it would be Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, revelations of horrible practices and so on and so forth that create indignation in the readership and force change. But I think that's relatively rare. I would say that what this does politically is to train us in thinking collectively and historically. That is, it trains us to understand that all of these people are part of very complex webs in which we find emergences and then blockages and tendencies and so forth. So I would say those two things, collectivity and historicity, we're being trained by the narrative form itself. That's why I talk about the construction of plot, the construction of narrative here, and the uniqueness of the construction. We're trained by that in a way to think in new ways, to think beyond individualistic stories, to think beyond the melodramatic opposition of good and evil and so forth, to think beyond race itself and really think in terms of class, I would say, rather than race. All of those things are, they're not lessons that The Wire teaches, but they're modes of reading reality that The Wire teaches. I would say also that, yes, truth, but it seems to me that what the last episode does is to show implicitly the failure of traditional realism, because in a way traditional realism is the newspaper reporting on structures as though they existed outside of time, things that don't change, forces that are sort of pitted against each other but sort of in an immobile way. And then the last year of The Wire shows that the press itself, as menaced as the Port of Baltimore, right, because newspapers, at least in the United States, are all disappearing, are under competition from television and so on, internet. The press is not capable, is susceptible to all kinds of gross lies and miscomprehensions, as with Jimmy's spread of this idiotic notion of the serial killer of these unemployed people. So the press is also not to be relied on as a realistic form of narrative, if you like, as a realistic source of information about how the totality really functions. And that's the way in which this series sort of vindicates its own narrative originality, as opposed to older notions of social realism that would simply say, okay, we have this class here, we have this class here, we have these groups, they're fighting, this is the outcome, and so on and so forth. Here, something much more complicated is going on, with a very transformation of the groups and their structures themselves and their interrelationships. So certainly you have a sense of the bureaucratization of the police force. You have a sense of the corruption of business and politics, and how they're all infiltrated by the drug rackets. There's also a theme of real estate development, which is fundamental to politics today. I would argue, I have argued somewhere, that all politics today is about land, is about land grabs, whether we're talking about Israel and Palestine, or the gentrification of this or that neighborhood, or the Islamic Caliphate. Everything is about land. And political. This is part of the relationship of postmodernity to space, I think. There were temporal forms of politics before. I think now all this is spatial, and that all comes across in The Wire, but that sort of we know. What we don't know how to do is to think in new ways about all this.
Muchas gracias. Supongo que hay varias, muchas preguntas. Tampoco sé cómo proceder, si con micrófono o...
Thank you for your presentation today.
Okay.
My question. Sorry? Yeah. My question is with regard, again, sort of on the politics side of things, and in terms of the impact of these shows that demonstrate a complexity where the lines between good and evil are very blurred, where good and evil are very ambiguous, and how that has an impact on the audience and how it interprets good and evil in real life, or how they can negotiate reality. Because when we see these kinds of representations, which are realistic, we learn that people are always negotiating and compromising and doing things that might be morally wrong all the time. And we can't rely on these ideas of good and evil anymore. We can't rely on ideas of salvation and of doing good things, and good things will happen in return. And so I'm wondering if you think that this sort of causes a reaction where we lose our sense of ethics or morality, and we turn to a more sort of utilitarian view where we're trying to get through life based on what's useful to us. And in doing so, we lose our sense of equality as a value, because not everyone is quote unquote useful. We begin to see people as having worth based on how they're useful to us rather than worth just as an individual.
I don't think so. I think that the whole notion of egotism that you're describing is part of this old set of moral judgments in terms of good and evil. I mean, the egotist is bad, the altruist is good, and so on. No, I think that what this kind of thing shows or ought to show is that the ethical judgments must be replaced by political judgments. That's the sense in which The Wire is political. I mean, that politics is a different matter from ethics. There are very strong individualities in this, but they're all, one of the great things, I think, is the way in which the collective and the individual is narratively balanced here. We have great characters, but they are all characters who are caught in their institutions. And it seems to me that it's not altruism, what I'm talking about in terms of utopianism. It's the transformation of the social structures themselves, of the collectivity itself. And it's the perception of those possibilities and also what thwarts them that makes us think differently and think politically. Whenever you think about how you can transform society, then you're thinking politically. And I would say that's what's happening here.
Buenos días. Me gustaría hacerlo en inglés, pero es horrible. Entonces lo voy a hacer. Le quiero agradecer su presencia aquí hoy.
Yeah, go ahead. I've
Okay.
got mine. We have some wonderful translators.
Sí. Y le quiero hacer una observación y voy a hacer una pregunta que probablemente está relacionada con el martes pasado y la globalización. La observación es que me resulta llamativa siempre que se habla de la crisis.
Habla un poco más despacio, Hernán.
Ah,
Sí, un pelín.
creí que lo estaba haciendo. Siempre que hablamos de crisis, me planteo si estamos hablando, con respecto a la novela, me planteo si estamos hablando de la crisis de la novela o de la novela de la crisis, porque se puede hacer varias lecturas con respecto a eso, ¿no? Claro, a mí me llama la atención cuando pienso en la crisis de la novela, puedo pensar en el siglo XIX español y veo muchísimas obras de literatura que hablan de la pérdida de Cuba o hablan de cómo se entendió por la novela en esa época la pérdida de valores y de conceptos, y podemos ir más atrás en el tiempo, podemos ir hasta el tiempo presente y no deja de cambiar, ¿no? Al final la rueda gira y todo vuelve al sitio, ¿no? Con respecto a la crisis, en la novela, quizás esto que hablo de la pérdida, por ejemplo, para España del imperio con la caída de Cuba, no está muy lejos de la caída de los Lehman Brothers de la actualidad. Eso por un lado. Con respecto a la globalización, me gustaría hacer un nudo y a ver cómo puedo anudarlo, porque usted ha hablado hoy del género de los detectives en Escandinavia, en Australia, en China, ha hablado de Vázquez Montalbán, ha hablado de una serie de conceptos que no dejan de ser comunes, típicos, tópicos, aunque tengan pequeñas particularidades locales según el país, y que hacen un guiño a los ciudadanos de ese país, precisamente. Entonces me planteo, y ahora va la pregunta, ¿en qué medida afecta la globalización a la consideración de algo tan común como que el mensaje es el mismo? Porque parece un poco erróneo la idea de globalización, porque no sé si se habla en qué sentido, en el sentido cultural, económico, o qué. Y me planteo si no es una vez más la visión eurocéntrica que vende la misma idea para todo el mundo. Creemos que globalización es vender un solo concepto cultural y me llama la atención, por ejemplo, El otro día salió la noticia de que la Universidad de Texas ha comprado los archivos de a la familia García Márquez, de Gabriel García Márquez. Ha habido mucha polémica en Colombia sobre esto y de repente, pensando sobre ese hecho, he descubierto que él precisamente generó, un universo que no es global, ¿no? Para poder entender la realidad del realismo mágico, generó una serie de claves que no son entendibles de manera globalizadora, ¿no? Sin embargo, para ellos hablar de la literatura europea, la pintura del siglo de oro, para ellos es muy común, para ellos es muy accesible, pero no lo conocen, no tienen acceso, ¿no? Nosotros, ¿cómo entendemos esa literatura, ¿no? ¿Cómo no será esa la nueva literatura, que no tiene nada que ver con los mismos códigos que nos venden desde ciertos valores? Yo también estoy de acuerdo con que la prensa dejó de existir cuando el empresario compró los medios de prensa, pero quizás las nuevas formas de la novela tengan que ver con antiguas formas de la novela, y pienso en Mikhail Bulgakov a principios del siglo XX en Rusia, y pienso a lo mejor en el realismo mágico, pienso, no sé, ¿en qué medida hay globalización?
In reality and the real. How to show the real behind what we think of as reality. Reality isn't false, but it's appearances, the philosophers might say. How to show an essence behind appearance, and I think they did something like that, and I think what they did, but whether that was a modernism or a postmodernism, that's another question that I don't think we can argue here. What I would say about the crisis of 2008 is simply that finance capital can't be represented in the same way as the structures of imperialism. Those can still have heroes and villains and so on. Finance capital, it's much harder to show its global operations in terms of individual characters. And therefore, new forms emerge, and I think some of this, I would hesitate to call The Wire postmodern in that sense either, but I think we do see an attempt to create new forms of narrative here, and that's part of what we're talking about.
Bueno, pues yo creo que con esa invitación a crear nuevas formas de narrativa, de narraciones, de arte, que sean capaces de diagnosticar de manera eficaz la realidad y de quizá conducir hacia otros caminos utópicos o no, yo creo que le daremos las gracias otra vez por su generosidad al profesor Jameson y quedamos emplazados a seguir leyendo y seguir pensando estas cosas. Mil gracias, de verdad.